Tonjonmeaker. Chapter 1 Prologue. At the age of 15, after I graduated from middle school, my father told me something insane. The blood of the devil flows through our family. At that time, I was glad that I heard this just after I graduated. It would be scary to think about what I might have done if I heard this while I was still in middle school. In any case, my father wisely recognized that I was thinking about sending him to a mental asylum. Even now, I could never forget that moment. When blue flames bloomed out of my father's eyes. However, fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, that was his only power. My father explained to me that it was because there was too much human blood mixed in that had caused the inherited devil's blood to thin out. But in this world, there's something called atavism. This is where the extent of my power has stopped, but perhaps you or your children may be able to exert even greater powers. That is why I am telling you about the history of our family. What my father was talking about was that our ancestors' traits could suddenly manifest themselves several generations down the line. Naturally, I was unable to fall asleep that night. Due to the expectation of what abilities I might inherit, I spent the next few nights wide awake in anticipation. A few days later, however, I had a realization. Even if the blood of the devil was running through our veins, my father was still just the owner of a local chicken restaurant, who just so happened to have the ability to turn his eyes into a bluish flame color. I, on the other hand, was just the son of that owner, who was slightly stronger than other children my age. But 5 years later, they came for me. Chapter 2 Taking the Throne. The commonality between men who attended schools of engineering, following an all-male middle school and high school, was very simple. They were unable to properly communicate with women since they barely had any interaction with them. For Chwiryong, however, things were a bit different. He was the 20-year-old son of the local chicken restaurant. Even though he couldn't communicate well, he had a good mindset. So, your master's bloodline has died out? Yong-ho was sitting in front of his computer in just a pair of boxers and a t-shirt as he asked the two people behind the monitor. One was an elderly white-haired old man, who gave off the aura of a butler, while the other was a young beauty dressed in a black suit. From the looks of it, the old man did not seem to be human. He was covered in red wrinkled skin, and on his head were two small horns sticking out amidst his white hair. He couldn't see it from this angle, but he knew that it wouldn't be strange if there was a tail sticking out from his back. That's right. You're the descendant of a great figure. One of the 7 deadly sins, Mammon, the king of greed, bloodline is about to die out. How could this not be such a tragic event? However, his bloodline had not completely died out yet. Chwiryong is still here. The cold voice of a woman interrupted the old man, who sounded like he was about to burst into tears. The silver-haired lady had light brown skin, which resembled the color of melted chocolate. She was someone Yong-ho would do a double take on if he saw her in public, due to just how beautiful she looked, and it wasn't just because he was an inexperienced engineering student. Her hair was tied up high into a ponytail, and in between the loose strands were two small horns about the size of a thumb, visible just above her ears. Her ears were pointed like an elf's, and just like the old man, she did not seem to be human. Yong-ho unwittingly glanced at the woman and then turned his gaze back to the old man, giving off a cough. He calmed his mind and took a deep breath. He said, "Let me go through it once again. The lineage of the demon king Mammon, one of the 7 deadly sins, is about to die out. If a demon, no, the head of a dungeon isn't there, then the dungeon will soon die. If the dungeon dies, then the dungeon spirits residing there shall also die. So you came to me, in search of the demon king Mammon's descendants, to take the place as the head of the dungeon? Oh, you are quite wise. The descendants of Mammon are indeed intelligent." The old man spoke with a feverish voice. Yong-ho became a bit suspicious from the old man's fervent reaction and turned his attention to the woman instead. As expected, the woman explained coldly, "Your blood is the strongest amongst all the remaining descendants. And in fact, Only you alone has the power to become the master of the dungeon. It didn't make sense to him that there only remained one descendant of the Demon King. After all, his father was also alive and well. It now makes sense. Among the descendants, only Young-ho himself had the power to take the throne of the dungeon. So that's why they come to talk to me, no, more accurately, to kidnap me. Young-ho had no doubt that the figures in front of him were demons. All of a sudden, a blue portal, like something seen out of a video game, opened up in the middle of the room. Furthermore, when Young-ho finally came to his senses, he found himself in a room he had never seen before. The computer and desk he was sitting at remained intact, but everything else had changed. The room was made out of stone and looked quite dull, with two people standing in it beside him. Young-ho tried his best to stay calm. If his father hadn't told him when he was young that he had inherited the blood of a demon, he would have probably had quite an adverse reaction to this event. Either screaming out of terror or by begging them to stop being crazy and send him home. Young-ho took another deep breath. He had to stay alert. I've already been kidnapped. They sounded amicable, but Young-ho had still been kidnapped into an unknown place. Perhaps this was what they called the demon's dungeon. It seemed to be, considering the appearance of the room. What would happen if he declined to be the head of the dungeon? If there was no head, then the dungeon would die. If the dungeon dies, then the dungeon spirits living here would also die. If that was true, then it was a matter of life and death for the two figures in front of him. There was nothing preventing him from making such an extreme choice. The descendant of a demon. The head of a dungeon. If this was 5 years ago, he would have accepted unconditionally. At that time, Young-ho was completely obsessed with the fact that he was a descendant of a demon. But now that he was more experienced, it was a little different. However, to be honest, he still had the same fantasy about being a demon king, but there were a few more conditions attached. Will I be able to return home? What? Will I be able to return home if I become the head of the dungeon? I would like to occasionally go back, for like, a vacation. Astonished by Young-ho's further explanation, the old man breathed a sigh of relief. The woman spoke instead, that's definitely possible. And, since you have human blood, you can't stay in this world all the time. Sometimes, you'll have to be with other humans once in a while. He could go back home. Furthermore, if what they said was true, they had no reason to stop him from going home. Young-ho rolled his eyes again. The old man looked nervous, while the woman looked stiff as a rock. Both of their eyes gave off feelings of angst. It didn't seem to be a lie that both of them could die if Young-ho decided to not save the dungeon. The descendant of a demon. Perhaps the fantasy that he had so earnestly wished for since middle school was now being fulfilled. Am I thinking too positively? He had been taken to an unfamiliar place by the two demons standing in front of him, who would eventually die if they were unable to find somebody to take over the dungeon. There was virtually only one choice in this sort of situation. This was the road that he was destined to travel. If it was so, then he didn't want to be dragged along that path. If he was going to take the seat as the next dungeon king, then he would do it with his own 2 feet. Okay, I'll be your next king. After hearing Young-ho's awe-inspiring declaration, the old man began to shed tears of emotion. The silver-haired woman also placed a hand on her chest and breathed a deep sigh of relief. Seeing how their reactions were so human, Young-ho couldn't help but smile. This wouldn't be such a big deal, would it? Young-ho was a descendant of a demon. There was a time when he thought so. With a dumb look on his face, Young-ho sat on the demon's throne. It was just a simple and crude stone throne with zero decoration. The throne room also looked quite bare. The room was square, gloomy, and entirely made out of stone. The only color that could be seen was a red carpet draped in between the throne and the door opposite to it. There was, of course, no windows, either. How did the previous king die? He was ashamed and humiliated about not being invited to the demon banquet, so he committed suicide. The family of the demon Mammon had fallen into ruin. No, to be exact, it wasn't a complete wreck, but it was certainly on the verge of being so. Though Young-ho wasn't exactly sure if there was much difference between the two. There were many demon kings in this world. There were around a dozen of them, with each one having their own dungeon, and once every few years, they would all gather at the demon banquet. In the past, being one of the descendants of Mammon, one of the 7 deadly sins, would have been a glorious affair. The fall of the Mammon family was the subject of contempt amongst the other demon kings. Which, at the very least, was an example to others to not follow in the same suit. The large dungeon was on the verge of collapse, and there weren't any dungeon spirits that were managing the place, either. Currently, the only spirits left in the dungeon were the guard, Catalina, and the butler, Eliger. At the time of death of the previous dungeon head, most of the spirits either moved away to other dungeons or became wandering spirits. Young-ho decided that he had to think positively. He felt proud that he was a descendant of the great demon, Mammon, but their present situations were quite different. Today was also the first time that he heard about his ancestor Mammon being one of the 7 deadly sins. So there was no shame in not being able to participate in the demon's banquet. Of course, there was no reason to commit suicide over it. As Young-ho ascended the throne, he did, however, have to give up some of the delusions he had hoped for as a demon. He himself felt more familiar with the status of being the son of the local chicken restaurant or the engineering freshman rather than the status of a demon king. Seeing how Young-ho's reaction was calmer than they expected, Catalina let out a sigh of relief. At first, I thought he was going to be a cold ruler, but now, it seems like he's got more of a straightforward personality. Even if he wasn't going to become the head of the dungeon, would they have just given up and cried till their death? Young-ho shook his head to get rid of the pessimistic thoughts and asked Catalina, "Where's Eliger?" The moment that Young-ho had said that he would ascend the throne, Eliger had started rejoicing but then suddenly just disappeared. Catalina explained in a bright tone, "He went out to meet the dungeon's merchant. In order for you to become the next head of the dungeon, you'll need the merchant's assistance." What do you mean? He would need the help of the dungeon's merchant to become the head of the dungeon? Did that mean that he had to purchase some form of dungeon tenancy from the dungeon merchant? As if Catalina had read Young-ho's mind, she started to shake her head. In order to become the next dungeon head, you must undergo an initiation ceremony with one of the previous heads of the dungeon. But, as you already know, Mammon. Since the last head committed suicide, there isn't anybody we can invite? Instead of answering, Catalina just showed a sad expression. The more he looked at her, the more he realized how simple-minded she seemed to be. Is the dungeon merchant a former head of the dungeon? Young-ho asked tiredly. Catalina bit her lips a couple of times, and then looked Young-ho in the eyes and answered. They're not. That is. I'm sorry, but today's crowning ceremony is somewhat unofficial. After seeing her hands and feet fidgeting nervously, she was probably worried that Young-ho might back out of becoming the next head after telling him about the ceremony. At least Catalina and Eliger won't die now. This time, Young-ho found something positive to think about, which caused him to smirk. Perhaps being the son of a local chicken restaurant might actually have a more promising future than the next head of the Mammon family. I think they've arrived, Catalina spoke after carefully observing Young-ho's reaction. As if she had felt someone's presence, Catalina finished talking as the door suddenly swung open. Chapter 3 Taking the Throne 2, behind Eliger appeared a woman, dressed in highly revealing clothing, walking slowly toward them. Her long red hair flowed smoothly behind her like silk. A purple dress enveloped her milky white skin, revealing her shoulders and neck, and partially displaying her large breasts. Her dress was wrapped tightly around her thin waist, with a narrow slit down the side exposing her thighs. It is a pleasure to meet the descendant of the great Mammon. I am the dungeon merchant Saitri. After Saitri gracefully bowed toward him, Young-ho managed to maintain his posture and prevent extending his head into her gaping cleavage. It is a pleasure to meet you, Saitri. My name is Chun Young-ho, and I shall be taking Mammon's place as the master of the dungeon. Young-ho felt the need to say something but wasn't able to talk to her casually right away, so he decided to first just formally introduce himself. He was hesitant to reveal the fact that he was human, but time was just too short for him to come to a proper decision. Anyway, if being human was such a problem, then Catalina and Elgar wouldn't have to come and visited him in the first place. After hearing Young-ho's careful response, Catalina sighed in relief and Elgar gave a satisfied smile. Satori glanced at Young-ho for a moment and smiled seductively. Perhaps the Mammon family has finally regained its luck. It might have been an insulting remark to others, but Elgar seemed to revel in it. Catalina didn't seem to be as delighted as Elgar, but she appeared to agree with the sentiment as well. Did they not feel bad about the previous master? He didn't know the details, but he could understand their feelings to a certain extent. Due to the suicide of their former master, Elgar and Katrina were in danger of dying themselves. Then let's proceed. Chun Young-ho, please wear this necklace. Satori pulled out a necklace buried beneath her cleavage. It was made of gold with a large green gemstone attached to it, roughly about the size of 2 fingers. Young-ho had only just heard that Satori was going to attend the ceremony, never mind what was actually going to happen in it. Naturally, he didn't know what the necklace was specifically for, nor what Satori was planning to do from now on. No, regardless of that, he was already on the verge of paralysis due to Satori's exposed cleavage. After seeing how Young-ho looked somewhat nervous, Satori shook her head and then asked with a smile, "Oh, do you not know the ceremony?" Young-ho was a youthful South Korean male, who went to an all-male middle school, high school, and then entered a school for engineering. Seeing such a seductive woman smile while asking him a question made him realize that he lacked the ability to resist telling the truth to such a beautiful woman like her. After revealing that he didn't know with an awkward expression, Elgar stared at Catalina as if he was going to chew her up at any moment. He looked at her as if he was asking why she hadn't given Young-ho an explanation. Catalina tried to clumsily defend herself but eventually just shut her mouth. After all, speaking more would only further embarrass herself in front of their visitor. Satori then approached Young-ho and explained, "From now on, the ceremony will contain only the necessary procedures and skip all the formalities. By wearing this necklace around your neck, your 2 vassals and I shall perform the magic ritual which shall allow you to reawaken as a demon." After hearing the word, reawaken, Young-ho gulped nervously. Satori noticed Young-ho's expression and continued to talk in an alluring voice, "Master of the Dungeon is a special role amongst our kind in the demon world. Especially for you, Young-ho, who has succeeded the role of the great demon Mammon. You shall surely receive a great power. This necklace will not only help you awaken your powers as a demon, but it shall also tell you the type of power that you have awakened." As Satori finished talking, the necklace had already been placed around Young-ho's neck. Elgar suddenly spoke up, "A title that indicates your power will appear on the jewel. Like the Demon of Magic, or the Demon of Magic, or the Demon of Magic." It was clear what title Elgar personally wished for. With a nervous expression, Young-ho examined the jewel embedded on the necklace. "Then let us begin the ceremony." Rather than a pedestal, the throne just rested on the flat floor, so Satori was able to create distance between them by simply taking a step back. Catalina and Elgar, on the other hand, naturally stood on the left and right side of Young-ho. Facing Young-ho, Satori closed her eyes and began to quietly chant in an unknown language. Soon, Catalina and Elgar followed suit, and Young-ho began to feel his first genuine fear since entering this new world. It was the fear of change. The fear of a new life vastly different from his past. His blood began to boil. The louder their voices became, the hotter his body began to feel. His mind was beginning to lose focus. Pure pleasure overwhelmed his mind as he bathed in the feeling of being reborn anew. Mere moments later, Young-ho breathed out, releasing all the heat within himself. He suddenly felt himself breathing quite differently than before. The pupils of his eyes had also changed. His eyes shone with an emerald light as a message appeared before him. The power received through awakening. It was a message symbolizing the reawakened Young-ho. The Demon King of Evolution, Pant. Pant. With a heavy breath, Young-ho raised his head. Now that he had attained the position as the master of the dungeon, he was able to somehow connect with the feelings of Catalina and Elgar. Elgar felt overjoyed. He was trembling with excitement even though Young-ho hadn't received the power he had hoped for. Catalina, who had a calmer mindset, still felt both relief and excitement coursing through her. Relief, he could understand. After all, she finally had a place to return to. But, excitement? Why was she feeling excited? Young-ho shifted the gaze of his bright green eyes to Saitri. He was unable to read her feelings, but he did notice a gleam held within her purple eyes. The Demon King of Evolution. This wasn't the only power. As he reawakened as a demon, there was another power that had revealed itself. The 7 deadly sins, greed. That was the real reason why Elgar and Catalina were so thrilled. It was the power of the Demon King, Mammon, that had not been revealed amongst his descendants for many years. Young-ho looked within himself. He wanted to know more about this power that he had awakened. But, at that very moment, the mysterious voice of a young girl rang out in his head. An intruder has entered the dungeon. Young-ho tightly closed his eyes and then sharply reopened them. From the very moment that he had awakened as a demon, he had become connected to the spirit of the dungeon, which now told him what he needed to do. As he widely opened his hand, a large window of light appeared before him. Inside the window, that looked like a computer screen, a bird's eye view of the dungeon was spread out before him. The Demon King Mammon, one of the 7 deadly sins, was clearly a formidable being. Even though he had experienced his downfall, the scale of the dungeon was truly enormous. It's useless, more than half of the dungeon was in ruins. Either the ceiling had caved in, the walls had collapsed, or the floor had given way. Even the surviving area wasn't in the best condition. Almost 4/5 of the remaining land had been deactivated. All rooms of little to no purpose had been deprived of mana supply for a long time. They were different from the empty stone room that Young-ho had first encountered. Even though its grade was the lowest, that empty stone room, however, was an activated space. Young-ho wasn't even able to access a deactivated room. If there were 100 rooms in the whole of Mammon's dungeon, then only 8 of those rooms would be usable. Most of those rooms were just empty stone rooms as well. Young-ho felt like he had just been scammed, but decided to suppress that feeling and enlarge the available rooms on the map before him. He wasn't sure if the system had functioned this way before, or if it had specifically tailored itself for him, as it operated like a smartphone. The 8 available rooms were connected in a straight line. Young-ho was located in the second room to the left, whereas the furthermost room to the right was the entrance of the dungeon. There was just a single intruder that had infiltrated the first room to the far right. Crimson Ogre. It seemed that the window of light was visible to Catalina and Elgar as well. Young-ho frowned deeply as he heard Elgar's frustrating cry. The spirit of the dungeon quickly provided him with new information. The heart of the dungeon is the room located at the far left of the screen. If the dungeon's heart is destroyed, then the dungeon will also die. At first, he wanted to ask how the dungeon would die if it was an inanimate object but decided to refrain from doing so. The reason that Catalina and Elgar had come to Young-ho in the first place was because the dungeon would die if there was no master to rule it. After passing through the first room, the Crimson Ogre then moved into the second. He wasn't sure if the ogre was really trying to invade the dungeon or if it had just gotten accidentally lost. Mammon's shabby dungeon only had a simple root configuration. Don't worry. There are many different types of traps within this dungeon, Elgar hurriedly shouted. Indeed, in the window before him, a summary of the dungeon was available, which showed him the markings of different traps installed in each room. Pitfall Trap, the most basic and classic type of trap that tricks enemies by covering a deep hole with a large mat. Arrow Trap, a trap that kills enemies by firing a dozen arrows. Fire Trap, a trap that destroys enemies with a flame created by magical power. Starting from the second room from the right, there were traps installed in each room. Nice, now this is more like a demon's dungeon. However, Young-ho's excitement barely lasted for even 5 seconds. The Crimson Ogre fell into the pitfall trap, but the hole only came up to the ogre's waist. After struggling for a bit, it managed to get out. I tried to dig the trap, but we lacked manpower." He ignored Delager's excuse and looked at the third room. Contradictory to the explanation, the arrow trap refused to fire a single shot. "We ran out of arrows." This time, it was Catalina making an excuse. Young-ho was patient. That was, until the ogre passed the fourth room with no issues, either. Young-ho sighed with disbelief. The magic to trigger the fire trap his. The Crimson Ogre then intruded upon the fifth room. Instead of covering his face with his hands, Young-ho looked expectantly at Catalina, the guardian of the dungeon. "Catalina, can you win against that?" It was a little awkward to ask her to do something like that, but since he was now the master of the dungeon, it was only natural. Catalina's face was filled with fear as she looked at the screen, but she nevertheless tightened her fists, as if she was hardening her heart. I'll deal with it." She looked as if she was about to cry. The Crimson Ogre then passed through the fifth room and was about to enter the sixth. They were running out of time. Young-ho focused on the screen in front of him, instead of looking at Saitri for help, who had a calm expression on her face. He analyzed all the information that the spirit of the dungeon had given him and devised a plan. He inquired about the remaining necessary information from the dungeon spirit. A room costs 10 mana to activate. The path from the heart of the dungeon to the entrance must always be connected. Young-ho quickly waved his hands. Since he had awakened as a demon, the magic from his hands could be imprinted onto the screen. He only had 100 mana points. However, the remaining balance of the dungeon was only 10 mana, so compared to that, he had 10 times more. It was now impossible to install a new trap into the sixth room. Not even considering the mana that would be required, he didn't even have the manpower nor the time to install any more traps. What other assets did Mammon's dungeon possess? Lots of useless space. That is, lots of inactive rooms with nothing inside. Young-ho placed his finger on the inactive room just below where he was currently residing. At the same time, he activated the room by consuming his mana and then swiped his finger across to the entrance, activating 7 rooms in total. In total, 70 points of his mana had been used. But, he was still not done. Waving his hands while tightly holding his breath, Young-ho deactivated the sixth room, the only room remaining between himself and the Crimson Ogre. The door in front of the throne room suddenly disappeared, as if it had never existed. His eyes darted back to the screen. The Crimson Ogre seemed perplexed by the sudden disappearance of the door. "Please, please." The ogre didn't seem to want to go back. It instead forcefully opened the new door in the left wall. At that same moment, Young-ho waved his finger again as he both reactivated the recently disabled old sixth room and then deactivated the new sixth room in one swift motion. He had to obey the rule that the heart and entrance of the dungeon must be connected at all times. It was extremely close. Not noticing that the door to the new sixth room had just disappeared, the ogre seemed to wander around a bit and then eventually exited through a door that he hadn't yet entered, a room leading to the entrance of the dungeon. Catalina and Delager opened their eyes wide in astonishment. Young-ho forgot to breathe as he watched the ogre's every move. Oh. The Crimson Ogre is fleeing. It's not fleeing, it's just leaving. Young-ho, however, did not blame Delager for his excitement. He was too busy trying to catch his breath as he slumped down onto the throne. He was lucky. He was able to lead it out since the ogre wasn't planning to attack the dungeon and instead had just gotten lost. Since the majority of Mammon's dungeon was empty space, he was able to create a way out through momentarily activating and deactivating certain rooms. Had a trap been installed in the sixth room, he would not have used such a method. The Crimson Ogre then completely left the dungeon. Then, as if it had been infected by Catalina and Delager, the spirit of the dungeon spoke in a bright tone. First victory. The attacking enemy has been successfully repelled. Acquired loot, acquired mana, of course, I got nothing. Rather, he had almost consumed all of his mana. However, he had won regardless. This was his first victory as the new master of the dungeon. It's a small victory, though. Young-ho, who was already dropped across the throne, further stretched himself out across it. It was at that moment that Saitri entered his vision. She was smiling. It was an unusually bright smile that didn't quite fit with her alluring beauty. Saitri looked back at Young-ho and quickly replaced the bright smile with her typical seductive expression as she began to speak to him. "Dear customer, I look forward to seeing you again in the near future." Without waiting for an answer, she took one of his Young-ho's hands and planted a gentle kiss on the back of it. She then gracefully turned around and left the dungeon like a swift breeze. A few seconds later, Catalina and Elgar quickly knelt before Young-ho, as if they had planned it beforehand. They then both spoke in a heartfelt tone. "I, Catalina, offer my allegiance to the master of the dungeon. I, Elgar, offer my allegiance to the master of the dungeon." A clumsy guard and a decrepit butler. The dungeon was in such ruins that it was almost destroyed by a lost ogre. "I just want to give up." However, he never said it out loud. After reawakening as a demon, Young-ho now truly understood. As the master of the dungeon was now a part of Young-ho. It wasn't something he could easily throw away. He just gave a hopeless chuckle and accepted the will of the two people in front of him, who had sworn their allegiance to him. Chun Young-ho, the Demon King of Evolution. The one who had inherited one of the 7 deadly sins, the power of greed. He had taken a great, yet dangerous, first step into the world of demons. Chapter 4 Demon Labor Mark. Suppose that in the last year of middle school, you were told that you were not a normal human being and that you, in fact, have demon blood running through your veins. And that they were able to prove it. If you had imagined yourself as a demon dozens, no, hundreds of times in the last 5 years, would that be considered normal? Young-ho had imagined it. He had imagined himself becoming a demon king and reigning over a kingdom. The reality was that he attended an all-male middle school and high school and graduated from an engineering college. Furthermore, he had also finished his compulsory military service. Despite that, Young-ho still continued to imagine such a life. Of course, as people grow old, so do the whims of their imagination. Nevertheless, even though it made him seem delusional, Young-ho still imagined. In the end, Young-ho had become a demon. Though, the reality of being a demon was quite different from what he had imagined. "It must have been when I was at the hot-blooded age of 17 when I imagined a slender nude succubus laying beside me." He wasn't entirely wrong. When Young-ho woke up, he was lying next to a beautiful silver-haired woman with light brown skin that resembled the color of melted chocolate. Though she wasn't naked nor lying on the same bed as Young-ho himself. Hey. Mammon's dungeon sorely lacked a supply of mana, and this was the only room that supplied a decent amount of it. On the floor of the throne room, there was an old red carpet draped from the entrance of the room to the throne. And there were 2 people lying next to each other, on top of it. One was Young-ho, who was sitting up, and the other was Catalina, who was covered in a monster skin cloak. Young-ho shook Catalina's shoulders and yelled at her, causing her to groan and writhe in apparent agony. As a mix between a succubus and a dark elf, she was weak to mornings. Ugh! Catalina gave off a moan while partially opening and closing her eyes again. The sound that she made was so peculiar, and the way that her face poked out from beneath the cloak made her look so beautiful that it caused Young-ho to suck in a deep breath. He had thought that he had gotten used to it, but Catalina was simply too beautiful for a man such as him, who had attended all-male school and graduated in engineering, to face so casually. Eventually, Young-ho gave up trying to wake her up and decided to get up himself while scratching his head. The dungeon's butler Elgar had gotten up early to go out and fetch some water. "We even need to go and fetch water to fill up the jar." Young-ho sighed once again as he thought about how much of a bad state the dungeon was in, but there was nothing he could do. According to Catalina and Elgar, it wasn't like this in the beginning. When the previous master of the dungeon was alive, the dungeon had still maintained quite a prestigious appearance, despite the fact that the rest of the demon world still associated it with the downfall of the Mammon family. After the last master decided to commit suicide, many things have changed. The summary of the story that Elgar told through tears was as follows. First, the dungeon spirits left the dungeon and robbed the dungeon of all its wealth, with the excuse that it was their retirement fund. Second, after the dungeon master died, since there wasn't anyone left to supply the dungeon with mana, they were forced to reduce the size of the dungeon. Unlike the other spirits, Catalina and Eliger belonged to the dungeon and couldn't leave, so their lives were put on the line. Third, it took them a long time to find the new master of the dungeon, Yongho. During that time, they had sparingly used the remaining mana to try and save it, so that's why they were now in this state. Yongho looked around the throne room with a blank expression. The dungeon master's throne room was truly vast. He probably couldn't have a game of soccer here, but he surely had enough room for a game of volleyball. Just doing a small touch-up would make a huge difference. Moreover, at least there isn't any debt. Yongho started to laugh after looking at the positive side. Instead of sitting back down in a daze, he checked to see what had to be done. At this moment, it was impossible to return home. To open a door between the two worlds required an immense amount of mana. According to Catalina and Eliger, they opened the portal with the belief that they might soon die. If Yongho had decided not to become their master, they would have either threatened him or broke down and started weeping. Regardless, it was impossible to go back or even contact home at this moment. Eliger later excitedly explained that once a permanent door was set up, Yongho would be able to go back home without a great consumption of mana. However, looking at Catalina's despondent expression, he was doubtful whether such a day would come. Yongho made a decision. In the demon world, this dungeon was his home. Therefore, the dungeon had to be remodeled to be suitable for people to live in. He planned to make the dungeon powerful enough to install a permanent portal between the two worlds. Yongho walked to the only piece of furniture available in the room, his throne. As soon as he sat down upon the throne, the voice of the newborn dungeon spirit greeted him once again. "Hello, Master. Isn't it a nice morning?" The voice imitated that of a young girl, which reinforced the fact that it was a newborn spirit. After nodding and greeting her back, Yongho waved his hand in the air. "Mammon's Dungeon, Master, Demon King of Evolution, Chun Yongho, Dungeon Rank, Dungeon Mana, 3300, Daily Mana Production, 30. This situation would cause anyone to feel uneasy, but Yongho didn't feel frustrated. The dungeon had fallen into ruin because it had been without a master. However, now that a master had returned, things would get better. Yongho closed his eyes as he decided to check his resources. The dungeon spirits, Catalina and Eliger. The butler Eliger wasn't useful in battle. He did, however, have the ability to take care of housekeeping. According to him, he has worked as a butler, a cook, and a teacher for the previous generation. The guard Catalina was currently the only fighter in the dungeon. Though, to be honest, he couldn't help but doubt her combat ability. According to Eliger's evaluation, she wasn't weak and she did have the ability to evaluate the strength of the Crimson Ogre. However, she seemed quite helpless before, so he couldn't really rely on her. Those two were the only available spirits. The remaining mana was just 30. Plus, 30 mana could be produced each day. The mana production would increase if either Yongho himself became stronger or the dungeon advanced in grade. A single jar for water. A worn red carpet. A throne. There was also the t-shirt and boxers that he was wearing, a suit left behind by the previous generation, and the desk that came with the computer from his world. He had also received the power of the 7 deadly sins, greed, but he wasn't sure when it would reveal itself. And finally, perhaps the most valuable asset that Yongho currently possessed. As he closed his eyes, he recalled his greatest power. The power of Demon Evolution. Chapter 5 Demon Labor Market 2 Evolution meant change. To adapt to one's environment, to become more efficient. However, it was a bit different in Yongho's case. The power that he possessed deviated from the original meaning. It went a step further. It activated one's potential through both body and soul. Through him, was the power to induce development, to advance one level higher. If one wanted to be faster, they would become faster. If one wanted to be tougher, they would become tougher. If one wanted to be stronger, they would become stronger. The power would guide one down their chosen path. It would bring out their full potential, and finally, awaken them as an entirely new being. That was the power of evolution. The almighty power that one may receive after awakening as a demon. Young-ho opened his eyes. He summoned his consciousness that was dwelling deep inside him. So what does this power really do? The power of evolution. He had a rough idea, but he was unsure of the extent of the ability and how to use it. If this was a game, then a tutorial window would pop up and give an explanation, but sadly this was reality. So Young-ho had to figure it out himself. So, like class change. No, perhaps this power is more akin to class advancement? In a game, you can upgrade your goblins to hobgoblins or upgrade your warriors to higher level warriors. Young-ho felt like he had a better idea than before, but he was still missing something. If that was the case, he would be better known as the Demon King of Advancement, instead of evolution. Furthermore, unless this was a game, it didn't seem that the term upper class was really used in this world. Regardless, this power helps beings evolve. Young-ho recalled the games that he used to play. Even the strategic simulation games had distinct levels for each unit. If a unit survived on the battlefield for long enough, they would typically accumulate enough experience to level up. Furthermore, the units that had leveled up were clearly stronger and more useful compared to low-level units of the same class. Of course, reality would not be the same as those games. No, Young-ho's power was the ability to evolve beings into superior versions of themselves, rather than just simply leveling them up. However, he had enough of an idea to catch the gist of it. As an engineering student, Young-ho wasn't satisfied that he couldn't find a clear process that would fit. However, for now, he decided to be satisfied with what he had. His power wasn't going anywhere, so he would just experiment with it, little by little, to fully understand the extent of his ability. Young-ho opened his eyes. He saw Catalina, still buried underneath her cloak, rolling around on the floor. Huh? Smoke began to rise from her body. It seemed to split into 5 separate streams of color. Red, blue, black, yellow, and violet. 5 separate colors of smoke rose up to the ceiling, all on a similar scale. The 5 different streams of smoke oddly didn't merge into one, and none of the separate colors seemed to mix together. Young-ho blinked. Every time he blinked, the colored smoke seemed to fade little by little, eventually vanishing entirely as if the smoke had never existed in the first place. Instead of being alarmed, Young-ho carefully thought about what just happened. Why did he suddenly see that strange smoke? Was it caused by either Catalina or himself? Young-ho stood up from his throne and walked towards Catalina, who was still fast asleep this late in the morning. She squirmed around underneath his cloak and showed no signs of getting up. Young-ho assumed that the source of this peculiar phenomenon must have been himself. If so, then what's different from before? It was simple. It was the power of evolution. Young-ho sat down on his backside in front of Catalina and swallowed dry saliva. He closed his eyes once again and awoke the power of evolution. It was just as he expected. Once again, 5 colors of smoke arose from Catalina's body. What do these different colors of smoke mean? This doesn't make sense. It was all too vague. Young-ho needed more explicit information. He wanted the data to be more accessible to him. More intuitive. Full comprehension with just a glance. Young-ho suddenly felt the power within him react to his desire. The power manifested itself from Young-ho's soul and began to take on a new form. Above the colored smoke, letters of light began to appear. Name, Catalina, female, race, half succubus, half dark elf. Main elements, wind, darkness. Secondary elements, lightning, water, earth. Stats, succubus, charm, mana, dark elf, agility, skill. Evolution rate, 31/100ths. Young-ho looked around. Over the letters of light were several square boxes of light, with each box containing different information. Succubus, charm specialization, 3, dark elf, agility specialization, 3, hybrid, 3.5, succubus, Mana Specialization, 3.5, Dark Elf, Skill Specialization, 3, he intuitively understood the information before him. What was visible before him was the basic information for evolution. It displayed the skills that they possess now as well as the potential skills they would be able to gain in the future. Each color represented a different attribute. The square boxes of light indicated the different evolutionary paths one would be able to take, like a form of skill tree. In which direction should he evolve Catalina? Which skill sets did he desire her to possess? Young-ho gulped. What would happen if he were to invoke the power of evolution? If he were to choose one of the 5 boxes of light, what kind of changes would Catalina undergo? He wanted to know. He wanted to experiment. He wanted to use his power. Ugh! Young-ho quickly retracted his hand that was subconsciously reaching out towards Catalina. He hurriedly took a couple of steps back and kept his distance. No. This was not something he could just do on a whim. He didn't yet know what would happen if he were to use this power. Experimenting on Catalina without having a clear idea of what exactly would happen was both reckless and insane. Furthermore, he didn't think that this power would just activate for free. It was just an assumption, but according to what had happened so far, to activate this power would most likely require the consumption of mana. Since yesterday, Young-ho's mana was still quite exhausted. For now, it was a good idea to refrain from an excessive consumption of mana. Her? After hearing Young-ho nearby, Catalina pulled her out from underneath the cloak. She must have been still half asleep as her eyes were still drooping. The smoke that was rising from Catalina's body gradually faded. Young-ho casually smiled and spoke as if nothing had happened. Are you finally awake? Instead of answering, Catalina just rolled her eyes and recovered herself with the cloak. She seemed to wriggle around quite a bit, most likely in an attempt to reorganize her clothes. After which, she then stood up and lightly cleared her throat. Her ears were so long that she almost had no earlobes, but he still noticed that they had turned a faint red. If he continued to stare at her, he felt that he would be branded as the stereotypical engineering student that likes to stare at beautiful women. Young-ho quickly recovered, then stood up and headed towards his throne. Elgar returned not too long after. It appears to be different from Catalina. Sir? Instead of answering Elgar's question, Young-ho just opened his eyes in a squint. Catalina and Elgar were different. Unlike Catalina, who had 5 different colors of smoke, Elgar only had 3 colors, red, blue and black. Name, Elgar, male, race, red demon, main elements, fire, darkness, stats, red demon, strength, stamina, evolution rate, 62/100ths, strength specialization, 2, stamina specialization, 2, mana specialization, 1. The information showed both the different traces and different abilities of Catalina and Elgar. The skill tree also differed slightly between them. However, the part that caught his eye the most was the evolution rate. Perhaps it was necessary to first fill this evolution rate for them to undergo evolution. The crucial question was, how would one fill it? Young-ho didn't have enough people to analyze and to fully understand the complete process. Although the way that he received information was game-like, it didn't mean that he would receive an explanation for skills as if it were actually a game. Catalina and Elgar didn't know much about the power of demon evolution. The Demon King's power was only given to demons who had become a king. That was the greatest difference between demon kings and ordinary demons. So, it was quite natural that they didn't know much about it. There weren't many who would nonchalantly expose their strongest weapon. They had seen their former master use their power often, however, they still didn't know about any additional functions or weaknesses that it had. The Demon King of Mana had powerful mana, while the Demon King of Fire controlled fire. This was the typical level of information that ordinary demons like Catalina and Elgar were privy to. Well, I'll just have to learn about it gradually over time. Young-ho shook his head in bafflement, and naturally switched topics. No, it's nothing. You still have to eat in the demon world, huh? The 3 of them were gathered around in a circle in the middle of the room, eating pancakes and vegetable soup. all of which were cooked by Iliger. Catalina flinched momentarily after hearing Young-ho's words and then spoke with the same cold-hearted persona that she had displayed when they first met. "I will go hunting after breakfast. I shall put my life on the line in order to bring you some meat." Although she was overflowing with beauty, after Young-ho knew of her true personality, he saw her in quite a different light. It was almost as if he could hear crying to herself about what she would do if she couldn't find any meat. "She really isn't much of a guard." He never said that aloud though, since Catalina would surely start to cry. He instead just nodded slightly and turned his attention towards Iliger. "Is it alright to increase the number of members in our family in this situation?" The inheritance that the previous head left wasn't completely gone. There was still the last legacy that Catalina and Iliger were keeping in case of any trials or hardships that they might encounter. Of course, this last legacy didn't surmount to much and accurately reflected the state of the Mammon family, but regardless, money was money. Iliger, however, had demanded that the remaining money be boldly invested. Spirits are essential in the development of a dungeon. A dungeon without any spirits doesn't exist. Iliger responded with an unusually serious expression. He wasn't wrong. In order to gather resources and install various facilities within the dungeon, labor was essential. This is the labor market for the demon world. Young-ho looked towards his throne. Chapter 5 Demon Labor Market 2 Evolution meant change. To adapt to one's environment, to become more efficient. However, it was a bit different in Young-ho's case. The power that he possessed deviated from the original meaning. It went a step further. It activated one's potential through both body and soul. Through him, was the power to induce development, to advance one level higher. If one wanted to be faster, they would become faster. If one wanted to be tougher, they would become tougher. If one wanted to be stronger, they would become stronger. The power would guide one down their chosen path. It would bring out their full potential, and finally, awaken them as an entirely new being. That was the power of evolution. The almighty power that one may receive after awakening as a demon. Young-ho opened his eyes. He summoned his consciousness that was dwelling deep inside him. So what does this power really do? The power of evolution, he had a rough idea, but he was unsure of the extent of the ability and how to use it. If this was a game, then a tutorial window would pop up and give an explanation, but sadly this was reality. So Young-ho had to figure it out himself. So, like class change. No, perhaps this power is more akin to class advancement? In a game, you can upgrade your goblins to hobgoblins or upgrade your warriors to higher level warriors. Young-ho felt like he had a better idea than before, but he was still missing something. If that was the case, he would be better known as the Demon King of Advancement, instead of Evolution. Furthermore, unless this was a game, it didn't seem that the term upper class was really used in this world. Regardless, this power helps beings evolve. Young-ho recalled the games that he used to play. Even the strategic simulation games had distinct levels for each unit. If a unit survived on the battlefield for long enough, they would typically accumulate enough experience to level up. Furthermore, the units that had leveled up were clearly stronger and more useful compared to low-level units of the same class. Of course, reality would not be the same as those games. No, Young-ho's power was the ability to evolve beings into superior versions of themselves, rather than just simply leveling them up. However, he had enough of an idea to catch the gist of it. As an engineering student, Young-ho wasn't satisfied that he couldn't find a clear process that would fit. However, for now, he decided to be satisfied with what he had. His power wasn't going anywhere, so he would just experiment with it, little by little, to fully understand the extent of his ability. Young-ho opened his eyes. He saw Catalina, still buried underneath her cloak, rolling around on the floor. Huh? Smoke began to rise from her body. It seemed to split into 5 separate streams of color. Red, blue, black, yellow, and violet. 5 separate colors of smoke rose up to the ceiling, all on a similar scale. The 5 different streams of smoke oddly didn't merge into one, and none of the separate colors seemed to mix together. Young Ho blinked. Every time he blinked, the colored smoke seemed to fade little by little, eventually vanishing entirely as if the smoke had never existed in the first place. Instead of being alarmed, Young Ho carefully thought about what just happened. Why did he suddenly see that strange smoke? Was it caused by either Catalina or himself? Young Ho stood up from his throne and walked towards Catalina, who was still fast asleep this late in the morning. She squirmed around underneath his cloak and showed no signs of getting up. Young Ho assumed that the source of this peculiar phenomenon must have been himself. If so, then what's different from before? It was simple. It was the power of evolution. Young Ho sat down on his backside in front of Catalina and swallowed dry saliva. He closed his eyes once again and awoke the power of evolution. It was just as he expected. Once again, 5 colors of smoke arose from Catalina's body. What do these different colors of smoke mean? This doesn't make sense. It was all too vague. Young Ho needed more explicit information. He wanted the data to be more accessible to him. More intuitive. Full comprehension with just a glance. Young Ho suddenly felt the power within him react to his desire. The power manifested itself from Young Ho's soul and began to take on a new form. Above the colored smoke, letters of light began to appear. Name, Catalina, female, race, half succubus, half dark elf, main elements, wind, darkness, secondary elements, lightning, water, earth, stats, succubus, charm, mana, dark elf, agility, skill, evolution rate, 31/100ths. Young Ho looked around. Over the letters of light were several square boxes of light, with each box containing different information. Succubus, charm specialization, 3, dark elf, agility specialization, 3, hybrid, 3.5, succubus, mana specialization, 3.5, dark elf, skill specialization, 3. He intuitively understood the information before him. What was visible before him was the basic information for evolution. It displayed the skills that they possess now as well as the potential skills they would be able to gain in the future. Each color represented a different attribute. The square boxes of light indicated the different evolutionary paths one would be able to take, like a form of skill tree. In which direction should he evolve Catalina? Which skill sets did he desire her to possess? Young Ho gulped. What would happen if he were to invoke the power of evolution? If he were to choose one of the 5 boxes of light, what kind of changes would Catalina undergo? He wanted to know. He wanted to experiment. He wanted to use his power. Ugh! Young Ho quickly retracted his hand that was subconsciously reaching out towards Catalina. He hurriedly took a couple of steps back and kept his distance. No. This was not something he could just do on a whim. He didn't yet know what would happen if he were to use this power. Experimenting on Catalina without having a clear idea of what exactly would happen was both reckless and insane. Furthermore, he didn't think that this power would just activate for free. It was just an assumption, but according to what had happened so far, to activate this power would most likely require the consumption of mana. Since yesterday, Young Ho's mana was still quite exhausted. For now, it was a good idea to refrain from an excessive consumption of mana. Her? After hearing Young Ho nearby, Catalina pulled her out from underneath the cloak. She must have been still half asleep as her eyes were still drooping. The smoke that was rising from Catalina's body gradually faded. Young Ho casually smiled and spoke as if nothing had happened. Are you finally awake? Instead of answering, Catalina just rolled her eyes and recovered herself with the cloak. She seemed to wriggle around quite a bit, most likely in an attempt to reorganize her clothes. After which, she then stood up and lightly cleared her throat. Her ears were so long that she almost had no earlobes, but he still noticed that they had turned a faint red. If he continued to stare at her, he felt that he would be branded as the stereotypical engineering student that likes to stare at beautiful women. Young Ho quickly recovered, then stood up and headed towards his throne. Elgar returned not too long after. It appears to be different from Catalina. Sir? Instead of answering Elgar's question, Young Ho just opened his eyes in a squint. Catalina and Elliger were different. Unlike Catalina, who had 5 different colors of smoke, Elliger only had 3 colors, red, blue and black. Name: Elliger, male, race, red demon, main elements, fire, darkness, stats, red demon, strength, stamina, evolution rate, 62/100ths, strength specialization, 2, stamina specialization, 2, mana specialization, 1. The information showed both the different traces and different abilities of Catalina and Elliger. The skill tree also differed slightly between them. However, the part that caught his eye the most was the evolution rate. Perhaps it was necessary to first fill this evolution rate for them to undergo evolution. The crucial question was, how would one fill it? Young-ho didn't have enough people to analyze and to fully understand the complete process. Although the way that he received information was game-like, it didn't mean that he would receive an explanation for skills as if it were actually a game. Catalina and Elliger didn't know much about the power of demon evolution. The Demon King's power was only given to demons who had become a king. That was the greatest difference between demon kings and ordinary demons. So, it was quite natural that they didn't know much about it. There weren't many who would nonchalantly expose their strongest weapon. They had seen their former master use their power often, however, they still didn't know about any additional functions or weaknesses that it had. The Demon King of Mana had powerful mana, while the Demon King of Fire controlled fire. This was the typical level of information that ordinary demons like Catalina and Elliger were privy to. Well, I'll just have to learn about it gradually over time. Young-ho shook his head in bafflement, and naturally switched topics. No, it's nothing. You still have to eat in the demon world, huh? The 3 of them were gathered around in a circle in the middle of the room, eating pancakes and vegetable soup, all of which were cooked by Elliger. Catalina flinched momentarily after hearing Young-ho's words and then spoke with the same cold-hearted persona that she had displayed when they first met. I will go hunting after breakfast. I shall put my life on the line in order to bring you some meat. Although she was overflowing with beauty, after Young-ho knew of her true personality, he saw her in quite a different light. It was almost as if he could hear crying to herself about what she would do if she couldn't find any meat. She really isn't much of a guard. He never said that aloud though, since Catalina would surely start to cry. He instead just nodded slightly and turned his attention towards Elliger. Is it alright to increase the number of members in our family in this situation? The inheritance that the previous head left wasn't completely gone. There was still the last legacy that Catalina and Elliger were keeping in case of any trials or hardships that they might encounter. Of course, this last legacy didn't surmount to much and accurately reflected the state of the Mammon family, but regardless, money was money. Elliger, however, had demanded that the remaining money be boldly invested. Spirits are essential in the development of a dungeon. A dungeon without any spirits doesn't exist. Elliger responded with an unusually serious expression. He wasn't wrong. In order to gather resources and install various facilities within the dungeon, labor was essential. This is the labor market for the demon world. Young-ho looked towards his throne. Chapter 7 Demon Labor Market 4. Young-ho's eyes turned green. It wasn't as noticeable compared to when his father did it, but there was still an obvious change in color when one looked closely. Young-ho slowly breathed in. As time went by, he could feel his mana slowly being consumed. Although the amount of mana that was being consumed was small, Young-ho's current lack of mana control caused even a small consumption to feel taxing. Let's not rush. He still had plenty of time. Young-ho looked up at the goblins displayed on the screen before him. Race, Goblin, M, Strength Specialization, This was the first time he had seen the specifications of a goblin, so he was surprised that it had only one category. Compared to the multiple categories of Catalina and Elliger, he felt embarrassed just by looking at it. Why is that? Was the goblin an inferior species compared to Catalina and Elliger? That was a possibility. However, a more plausible reason came to his mind. The goblins aren't my spirits. Catalina and Elliger were the servants of Young-ho. They were not normal spirits, but spirits of the dungeon, where both their body and soul were in servitude to Yang-ho. Of course, both of them being stronger demons was part of the reason, but Yang-ho believed that spirits belonging to a dungeon must have higher potential. I'm glad I have some information to go off now. After seeing the positive side of this situation, Yang-ho continued to inspect the goblins. Race, Goblin, M, Strength Specialization, 1, Race, Goblin, M, Strength Specialization, 0.5, Stamina Specialization, 0.5, there was a difference. It was a clear difference that Yang-ho could compare and analyze at once. Even if the race is the same, the field which they can evolve is different? It was a reasonable thought. Even if they shared the same race, they surely couldn't just be all identical. Does the number of stars indicate their potential in each field? Even if they evolved at the same rate, the results wouldn't necessarily be the same either. A smile appeared on Yang-ho's face. The more he understood how to use the power of evolution, the more he felt like he was playing a video game. Catalina doesn't seem to be completely useless after all. Despite them all being of the same goblin race, some of them had just one evolutionary route, while others had two. Catalina, however, had as many as 5 evolutionary routes, with each path having great potential and the lowest of which was 3 stars. From their current state, it was apparent that Elgar was on the same level as Catalina, with him having 3 evolutionary routes with a maximum potential of 2 stars. It was clear that Catalina's potential was above that of Elgar's. Once their powers grew greater, would they be able to venture out into the demon world on their own? When he thought of that possible future, he also thought of Catalina's crying face and couldn't help but doubt it. Yang-ho came back to his senses from his aspirational daydream. There was no time to waste. At this very moment, mana was being consumed for communication and power maintenance. All 30 goblins were currently displayed on the screen. Yang-ho quickly checked the information for all 30 of them. He narrowed it down to those who had either a large number of evolutionary routes or a large number of stars, potential power. No 04, Race, Goblin, M, Strength Specialization, 1, Stamina Specialization, 1, No 17, Race, Goblin, M, Strength Specialization, 1.5, No 22, Race, Goblin, M, Stamina Specialization, 1.5, wow, this is quite difficult. He was only able to pick 2 in total. In the end, it was their diversity and specialty that he would base his decision on. I don't have enough information. There was no way of knowing whether choosing a goblin with a strength specialization or a stamina specialization would be more effective for his workforce. It was possible that he was overthinking the situation, given that he would only be picking 2 workers for the moment. As Elgar had earlier said that eventually, he would need dozens of workers under his control. Regardless, he still could not just choose blindly. If this was a game, then he was only at the very beginner stage. Each worker was precious, and depending on which worker he chose, there could be a significant gap in the early development rate. Yang-ho, still in conflict, reached out inadvertently and touched one of the goblins on the screen. He took a step back in surprise. Yang-ho's hand had touched the box that marked one of the possible evolutionary routes. The goblin's appearance started to change. To be exact, a semi-transparent silhouette appeared on top of the goblin's figure. Yang-ho had a hunch. After swallowing dry saliva, he reached out and touched each box one by one. The strength specialization goblins turned into inverted triangles with broad shoulders. The agility specialization types generally had elongated limbs, and finally, the goblins with stamina specialization had an overall increase in toughness. It only displayed a silhouette, but it was enough. It was good enough to see how they evolved. I'll have to try it on Catalina and Elgar. But they weren't here, and what Yang-ho needed right now was 2 workers. Yang-ho, who was contemplating whether to choose between strength or stamina specialization goblins, finally came to a decision. You have selected number 17 and number 22. Thank you, sir. Please allow 1 to 2 days for delivery. Yang-ho laughed at the typical comment that he usually saw on online vendors. He had finally decided to pick one strength specialization goblin and one stamina specialization goblin. It was a little unfortunate that he wasn't able to find the most efficient option, but he thought that it was overall more important to gather different specimens to understand his power of evolution. Would you like to finish the transaction? Yes, no, the amount of mana that he had consumed was already huge. There was no reason to spend additional fees on communication when he had already finished the transaction that he had set forth to do. Young-ho pressed yes without hesitation. The space before him was now filled with the dullness of the throne room, replacing the white space from before. Did you manage to complete the transaction? Elgar asked Young-ho, standing a short, but respectful, distance away. From their facial expressions, Young-ho could easily tell that they appeared to be quite anxious. He didn't realize it at first, but since it was his first time visiting the virtual branch, he had spent over an hour browsing. Young-ho nodded and answered. Yeah. I bought 2 goblins. They'll arrive either tomorrow or the day after. Oh. Finally we'll have workers in this dungeon again. We'll be able to reinforce our traps and start building other facilities. He said it with such a voice, that it wouldn't be strange to see him start crying with joy. Young-ho could slightly understand Elgar's thrill with the situation. It had been almost a full year since the previous owner had committed suicide. During that period, the House of Mammon had continually fallen further into ruin, and it was very exciting to see the moment when the dungeon was beginning to flourish again. How exactly are the goblins delivered? Young-ho asked Elgar, who wiped away his teary eyes with the back of his hand. A courier who's affiliated with the dungeon market will come. They're always very quick and precise. It seems that couriers are a welcome sight in either world. There were times in Young-ho's life, where the anticipation right before a package arrives was more exciting than actually receiving the package itself. There was also more good news. Master. Catalina's voice carried waves of excitement from behind the door, causing both Young-ho and Elgar to look towards her at the same time. After about 3 seconds had passed, Catalina slammed open the door and strode in. She walked in carrying a wild boar on top of her shoulders, which made one wonder how her slender body had the strength to support such a beast. I caught a wild boar. I caught one. Her bright expression was filled with a mix of joy and pride. Her face beamed with so much brightness, that Young-ho and Elgar seemed to find it difficult to know how to immediately react. When Catalina didn't receive an immediate reaction from them, she suddenly became embarrassed and quickly put the boar down on the ground. She then tried to act cool about it. It was too late, however. Young-ho began to laugh out loudly. He rose from the throne and lavished Catalina with praise, whose long ears were now dropping with embarrassment. Well done, Catalina. You've done a great job. You've done really well as the guard. You're definitely the best guard in our dungeon. Despite his lavishing praise, Catalina still maintained her cool expression and tried to act befitting of her status, but her long ears started fluttering uncontrollably like a dog's tail. How should he have reacted in a situation like this? Elgar gave a quiet chuckle, and Young-ho tried to restrain laughing any further. Nevertheless, he continued to compliment his guard. That night, it had now been 2 whole days since he had been crowned the Demon King of the House of Mammon. Young-ho, for the first time, had tasted meat from the demon world. Chapter 8 The Power of Evolution. On the day that they held the crowning ceremony, Young-ho had felt a change. It could not simply be described by the word awakened. He was literally reborn as a demon. Of course, many things had changed. The first change was that his body had been considerably strengthened. His physique was improving every day. Even when working out at a gym back home, he had never been able to gain a six-pack like he had right now. Furthermore, the muscles in his arms and legs had gotten noticeably larger. It was all because he now had mana. Amongst demons, the mana of a demon king was especially concentrated. Elgar explained that the stronger the mana, the stronger the performance of the physical body. Elgar is out retrieving water. Catalina, just like yesterday, was sleeping underneath her cloak. Young-ho thought about whether he should wake her up, but instead, ended up walking towards his throne. He examined his body using the power of evolution. Name, Chwiryong Ho, M, race, half-human/demon, Demon King. Main element, fire, darkness. Strength specialization, 1, stamina specialization, 2, mana specialization, 1.5, charm specialization, 1, agility specialization, 1, skill specialization, 2, 7 deadly sins? He was very satisfied by how many evolutionary routes that he had, but he expected to have had more stars. He still thought that demon kings were too overpowered. He didn't even know much about the potential of his own power of evolution. Even though he wasn't able to see much effect from the power of evolution at the moment, there were a lot of available opportunities to use it, so it would definitely become a more powerful asset later on. What's perplexing me the most is the power of the 7 deadly sins. Out of the 7 deadly sins, Mammon wielded the power of greed. Even if one was a descendant of Mammon, it didn't necessarily mean they would be able to use the power of the 7 deadly sins. That was why Catalina, Eligar, and even Saitri were surprised when the power of 7 deadly sins emerged from within Yongho. Since none of the previous generations of owners could wield it. However, Yongho had the power. Although the power hadn't fully awakened yet, it was still lying dormant inside him. A smile unknowingly crept onto Yongho's face, which he covered with a light cough. He then connected his consciousness to the spirit of the dungeon. He had a lot of work to do today. So this is the most southern edge of the demon world. Yes, that's correct. It's actually in the outskirts. In the past, during the era of Mammon, the entire southern region was controlled by the House of Mammon. While he was talking, tears began to linger in Eligar's eyes. He cried quite often for a demon. Yongho thought that Eligar was just a typical old man that missed his glorious past, but Eligar wasn't even born during the reign of Mammon. He turned his eyes away from Eligar towards the window of light before him. It's quite wide. It wasn't just wide, it was extremely so. He assumed, from the meager information before him, that the region he was in seemed to be wider than the United States. From there, Yongho's dungeon, the House of Mammon, was located at the most southern point. Just like Eligar had said, it was based on the outskirts. Just like in a video game, the dungeon's borders had plenty of space surrounding it to expand. Eligar, who wiped away his tears with a handkerchief, started to explain again. Currently, the demon world is divided into 6 powers. Those are the kings of the demon world. After several borders were drawn, this world was divided into 7 different regions. The southern wasteland, formerly owned by the House of Mammon, is now a land without any owners. The remaining 6 lands are ruled by the mighty demon kings who command all dungeon owners within their territories. The world itself was so large that even the nearest king's land was a considerable distance away. From Yongho's perspective, despite just starting out with 2 subordinates, there would likely come a day where he would have to meet those kings. However, regardless of that, he still had to keep a track of the overall situation. Yongho couldn't leave his dungeon in such a state, as it was now. As he became more powerful, the day would come where he would have to eventually face them. Furthermore, that was why Saitri had warned him. There was no need to ask for any further explanations. Yongho was not a pure demon, but a half-blooded demon. From the standpoint of the regular pure-blooded demons, this kind of irregularity was quite rare. There was also a high probability that the other demons would dislike his existence. That's why Eligar wanted to hide me. There were 2 reasons why they called for the dungeon merchant Saitri instead of any other demon kings for his crowning ceremony. One reason was that they didn't really know any other demons to call, while the other, and far more important reason, was that they were trying to conceal Yongho's existence as the next king of the House of Mammon. Even a simple Crimson Ogre had almost caused the ruined dungeon to perish. At this point, if any other pure-blooded demons were to attack, then it would be all over. The more Yongho thought about it, the more things he realized he had to do. For the moment, it seemed to him that being the owner of a chicken restaurant might be more prosperous than the owner of a dungeon. But Yongho still couldn't help but smile. No, it wasn't due to courage, but given that their situation was in such dire straits, he had a sense of challenge to overcome the odds. Elliger had a satisfied smile on his face after seeing the gallant appearance of Young-ho and continued to explain. First of all, the main aim is to restore the overall function of the dungeon. The window of light suddenly disappeared, and an aerial view of the dungeon appeared in its place. Almost all areas of Mammon's dungeon were either inactive or had collapsed. It's an embarrassing story, but since Mammon, none of his descendants have ever been able to fully revive the dungeon. Just finding the facilities hidden in ruined areas of Mammon's dungeon will help you tremendously in reviving the dungeon. In simple terms, that meant there were certain areas within the dungeon that he had to target first. It sounds good, but there must be a catch. Considering how the previous owners were not able to fully inherit the power of Mammon in the past, this would not be an easy task. Elliger, who noticed Young-ho's intentions, spoke up. At first, I think it'll be better to gradually develop the upper level. You could then build up your strength by defeating neighboring low-level demons. I think I'm probably the lowest level demon in the neighborhood. The demon world was a land of survival of the fitness. Conflicts with other demons were unavoidable. Then Elliger, which do you think is better, strength or stamina? Sir? Elliger quizzically blinked at the open question. Instead of explaining, Young-ho just activated his power of evolution. He wasn't planning on first testing out his power on Elliger, but he still wanted to see what the potential outcomes were. Name, Elliger, Race, Red Demon, Main Element, Fire, Darkness, Main Stats, Red Demon, Strength, Stamina, Evolution Rate, 62/100ths, Strength Specialization, 2, Stamina Specialization, 2, Mana Specialization, 1. Young-ho waved his finger in the air. He lightly touched a box of light that was invisible to others, except for himself. A faint silhouette appeared over Elliger's figure. Oh! In each of the evolutionary routes that he took, Elliger would transform into a buff demon, which was a stark contrast to his current form. He couldn't be absolutely sure since it was just a silhouette, but he believed that Elliger's wrinkled face might change as well. Sir? Elliger, who hadn't had a clue what was going on, called out to Young-ho with an anxious look. It's nothing. Young-ho, who had been absorbed into his research, deactivated the power. Immediately afterward, a voice sounded on the other side of the door. It was from Catalina, who seemed to be brimming with excitement. Delivery. The packages are here. They're here. After all, both demons and humans found it exciting when deliveries arrived. Young-ho and Elliger both looked towards the door with grins on their faces. Currently, the House of Mammon was composed of 8 large square rooms made out of stone. Young-ho didn't have to run to the dungeon's entrance to receive the package, but instead Catalina entered the throne room with a cart holding 2 large boxes. Master. They're here. She normally acted calm, but it seemed that the delivery was too exciting for her, as there was a large smile plastered on her face. Just like before, her long ears were fluttering like wings. Catalina quickly dragged the cart to the throne, and Young-ho, who had just gotten up from the throne, instinctively leaned over and patted her head. It felt appropriate for the moment. The boxes are smaller than what I imagined. The cart couldn't hold anything else, so he couldn't really say that they were small, but they were still smaller than he had expected. They looked like common wooden boxes found on docks, that were about 1 meter wide. The goblins are quite small. They're probably curled up in those boxes. They're curled up in there? He thought that it was absurd that someone would deliver living creatures in a wooden box. However, since Catalina and Elliger didn't seem to be bothered by it, Young-ho didn't mention it. He ordered Catalina to open the box with a directed glance. Using her thin arms, Catalina easily unloaded the boxes onto the ground. Okay, I'll open them up. Okay. When Young-ho gave the go-ahead, Elliger broke open the seal of the dungeon market and used a crowbar to open the lid of the box. As if under the influence of some sort of device, the entire box broke apart and revealed its contents. Just like Elliger and Catalina had mentioned, there was a goblin curled up inside. It had green skin, a big head and bulging knuckles on its hands and feet, Young-ho looked at the goblins meticulously, as they seemed to be frozen in place. Eliger explained the problem. If you register them with the dungeon first and then inject them with mana, then they'll start to work. They're currently frozen due to the magic of the dungeon market. Would you like to register the goblins as dungeon spirits? The spirit of the dungeon asked Young-ho. Young-ho nodded without hesitation. Registering 2 goblins as dungeon spirits. As soon as the spirit of the dungeon finished speaking, a red pentagram appeared over the goblins' heads. Young-ho swallowed his dry saliva. It wasn't just because he had high expectations for the goblins. He had felt the movement of mana. He had felt it transfer from himself to the dungeon, and then from the dungeon to the goblins. Moments later, the goblins started to tremble. They suddenly opened their large bulging eyes, and then slowly stood up. The goblins looked up at Young-ho with a blank stare. They were each about 120 centimeters in height. About the same size as lower grade elementary school students. They may be small, but goblins are natural workers. They're the best spirits for value for money. They hardly eat anything but still work hard. Is this not child labor? After facing Eliger's content face, Young-ho quickly turned towards the goblins. The goblins were still dazed. It wasn't due to the after effects of waking up, but they were generally, as stated in the manual, out of it. Sir, would you please give them your first command? Anything will do. Eliger spoke, while Catalina excitedly alternated her gaze between the 2 goblins and Young-ho with bright eyes as if expecting something wondrous to happen. Young-ho continued to stare at the goblins and then shook his head. No, not yet. If I just use them like this, then it'll be like child labor. Sir? Eliger asked with a confused look on his face. But instead of answering, Young-ho took a deep breath. And activated the power of evolution. Chapter 9 The Power of Evolution 2 Race, Goblin, Main Element, Earth, Main Stats, Strength, Stamina, Evolution Rate, 100/100ths, Strength Specialization, 1.5, Stamina Specialization, 1.5, After officially registering the goblins as dungeon spirits, he could now see all the evolutionary information that he couldn't see back at the market. Furthermore, luckily, both of them had already reached an evolution rate of 100. It was most likely because they were already the weakest spirits, so they couldn't go much lower. Eliger and Catalina continued to look at Young-ho with dry saliva in their mouths. Young-ho raised his hands in the air, instead of explaining it to them again. Boxes of light appeared over both of the goblins' heads. The power of evolution was the Demon King's power. It was a power that awakened from Young-ho's soul and was closely intertwined with his very being. So, of course, activating it felt natural. Flames rose from Young-ho's green eyes, as mana was released from his fingertips. The goblins began to tremble. Eliger held his breath as he felt the mana from Young-ho inject into the goblins. Catalina stared at Young-ho with an anxious face. Moments later, a green aura began to envelop the goblins. The goblins' cries filled the room. Ahem! Young-ho hurriedly stepped back while coughing roughly. It was difficult. He felt as if all his energy had been drained out of him. However, Young-ho still had a grin on his face. Eliger covered his mouth with both of his hands, his eyes turning red like usual. Whereas, Catalina quickly went over to help Young-ho. Her eyes widened when she looked back to the goblins. The goblins had transformed. The goblin with a strength specialty had grown more than 15 centimeters taller. Its frail shoulders were twice as large as before, and its upper body had formed into a perfectly inverted triangle. Even though its legs were short, its arms were large and sturdy. It was like looking at a baby gorilla. Meanwhile, the goblin with the stamina specialty had also transformed. Both its upper and lower body had developed in balance, with muscles appearing on its thin arms and legs. It initially seemed shorter than the other goblin, but after it fully extended its bent waist, it suddenly became taller. This is the power of evolution. Eliger was elated. While Catalina was still staring at the goblins with a shocked expression on her face, Young-ho smiled and gathered the remaining mana. He wanted to lie down and fall asleep right away, But instead, he activated the power of evolution again to look at the goblin with strength specialization. Race, Goblin, M. Level 1 Spirit, Main Element, Earth, Main Stats, Strength, Stamina, Evolution Rate, 0-100, Strength Specialization, 1.5, Stamina Specialization, 1, Intelligence Specialization, 0.5, a new intelligence stat had appeared. Moreover, that wasn't the only change. A large box of light had appeared above the goblin's stats. Young-ho felt great excitement as he read what was inside. Promotion, Hobgoblin, Promotion. Transcendence. Class change, no, class promotion. Everything was good. If they evolved once more, then the goblins in front of him would transcend even further along the goblin race. It was clear that the very nature of their existence would rise. Though in the end, they're just a couple of evolved goblins. Despite being cynical, he couldn't wipe the smile off his face. So what's next after hobgoblins? Goblin King? High Goblin? Was it possible for Catalina and Elgar to be promoted like that? Come to think of it. That was when Young-ho suddenly realized, with a worried look on his face, that Catalina was hugging him halfway. Perhaps because he only just came to a realization, but he could really feel Catalina's presence, through his arms, waist, and chest, suddenly awash over him. Despite being reborn as a demon king, Young-ho was still unable to overcome his shyness around women. It is nice, however. He didn't have any energy left. He naturally leaned his body against Catalina's. That's what Young-ho thought anyway. He decided, without hesitation, to just lean against her even more. Suddenly, Catalina yelled. "Oh, my god! Is that a horn?" Young-ho jumped at Catalina's sudden cry. Elgar also screamed. Small horns were visible on the goblins' foreheads, almost like small rocks jutting out of a cliff. Elgar stared at them with tears filling his eyes. He was so moved that he had been brought to tears. Oh, mighty Mammon. Now, he was just bawling his eyes out. Young-ho decided that Catalina was probably a better person to ask at the moment. Is it that great, Catalina, that the goblins have horns? At Young-ho's question, Catalina gawked at him with a dumbfounded expression on her face. They were standing right next to each other, so Catalina's beautiful face was right in front of him. She started to breathe roughly. After staring at Young-ho's face with a bewildered look for a while, Catalina yelled gleefully. "It's amazing. Fantastic. Enno. You're amazing." After yelling with excitement, she tried to calm herself down and control her excited tone. Instead of teasing her, Young-ho asked her once again. "So, why is it so amazing?" Catalina once again became dumbfounded. But, only for a moment. To demons, it was common knowledge, but she realized that for Young-ho, however, it was completely unknown, since this was only his third day as a demon. After helping Young-ho sit down on the throne, she tried to catch her breath. She then started to explain in a calm manner as possible. For demons, horns are a symbol of strength. A demon's horn is a type of organ that draws in the mana that exists in the world. The stronger your mana, the greater and larger your horns will become. Of course, having a lot of large horns would become uncomfortable, so most demons use magic to conceal them. But, anyway, that's why horns are so important. It's also possible to get a rough idea on the strength of a demon based on the number of horns they have. Even though her visible excitement had died down a bit, her voice was still traveling at high speed. As if she was running out of the air, she kept on having to stop talking and take a breath. After taking another couple of breaths, her explanation continued. It's not that easy to increase the size or number of horns. Most demons live the rest of their life with the same horns they were born with. Strengthening your mana is the only way to increase the size or number of horns you possess. It's different for each case. But? In response to Young-ho's question, Catalina closed her eyes. She took a deep breath and said with a relatively calm face. Goblins don't originally have horns. Though there is an occasional rare case with a goblin being born with a very small horn, it's still very rare. Goblins don't have much mana in the first place, so it's almost impossible for them to increase their number of horns. But master, you give those goblins horns. Those goblins have horns. Elgar spoke again with reverence. His voice was trembling with emotion. Young Ho now understood why Catalina had been so excited, and why Elgar had been so moved by what he had done. The power of evolution. He remembered the sparkle in Citri's eyes. He understood now why she seemed impressed by him, despite her introducing herself as an influential figure. Young Ho looked at the goblins again. Perhaps it was the effect of their evolution, or maybe because they now had horns, but they looked more intelligent now. When their eyes met, the goblins quickly knelt down and spoke in a stammering tone. Master, Master. We pledge our allegiance to you. Catalina suddenly opened her mouth wide with joy, while Elgar started to weep again. Young Ho guessed by their reactions that goblins talking was considered pretty amazing as well. Young Ho sat back down on his throne again. He asked Catalina once again, who was still overcoming her shock. It was about the horns. Chapter 10 The Power of Evolution 3 Why don't I have horns? Young Ho's question was quite simple. Why did he not have horns? If the horn was such an important organ for demons and was essential for the accumulation of mana, how come Young Ho, a demon king, didn't have any? Was it because he was half human? Catalina blinked in surprise, with a face full of astonishment, at Young Ho's sudden question. Elgar also looked towards him with a surprised look on his face. Huh? What's wrong? Well. You do have a horn? Young Ho blinked at Catalina's reserved answer. Catalina carefully raised her hands and pointed to the small horns that protruded slightly above her ears. Look, they're in the same position as mine. Young Ho was quite shocked. But, he understood it to some extent. If he thought about it, he hadn't seen a mirror since he'd moved to the demon world. He had indeed felt something strange when he washed his hair, but he would have never guessed that they were horns. This damn dungeon doesn't even have a mirror. Young Ho mimicked Catalina and placed both of his hands above his ears. These are horns? Catalina nodded instead of answering. Disappointment filled Young Ho's face and voice. How come a demon king only has 2 horns? Furthermore, they were both quite small. They were more like small rocks than horns. And even that was a compliment. Rather, it felt more like his bones were just slightly jutting out. No wonder he didn't realize. You haven't been a demon king for long. The power of the dungeon will become your power. As the dungeon grows again, so shall your power. Though, the opposite is also true. Elgar hurriedly explained. Catalina nodded her head once and turned into the initial calm and collected figure she was when they had first met. It's true that the stronger one's mana becomes, the more horns one will have. However, the number and size of the horns are not an absolute indicator of power. Young Ho now knew her true nature hiding behind that composed and cool mask, but since she was explaining with a serious expression, he decided to take her seriously. Well, I've got a lot of things I need to work on. As Elgar had said, he had to become stronger. It was too early for him to feel disappointed. After collecting his thoughts, Young Ho looked back towards Catalina. As she continued to talk, he was becoming more curious. You said that demons usually shrink or hide their horns? Yeah. Young Ho continued to stare at Catalina, who fortunately quickly understood what he was asking. She spoke again after lightly coughing. Ahem. Then I shall now release my mana. There was no reason to stop her, so Young Ho simply nodded and folded his arms. After taking a step back, Catalina took a deep breath and released her mana. A change in mana. Opening up. Young Ho could feel the shift in mana in Catalina before him. This was what it felt like when a spirit of the dungeon released its power. It was as if he could physically see it. Catalina's mana. Her soul. He could feel her mana, her spirit's color, and her attributes. Ha. Catalina stood up straight after catching her breath. Above her long ears, 2 yellow horns sprouted out, each roughly the size of the span of an adult hand. Just as he had expected, they weren't that big, It had more of a resemblance to an elephant's ivory tusks rather than deer antlers. Perhaps, it was because she had just released her mana, but Catalina seemed to have a different aura around her than usual. She now felt more like a sharp blade. After examining her horns, Young-ho stood up from his throne and bluntly asked her. "Hey, could I touch them?" "Why yes, master." Catalina accepted while blushing, causing the atmosphere of the room to take a strange turn. She tilted her head forward slightly, while nervously clenching her fists. She lightly bit her lips, and the way her eyes darted around the room indicated her anxiety. After feeling the change in mood, Young-ho swallowed his dry saliva. He slowly extended his hand, and gently touched one of Catalina's horns. As soon as he touched her horn, Catalina flinched, causing her shoulders to tremble slightly. Her horns felt cold and sturdy, accompanied with a soft texture. It was clearly true that the horns were regarded as a mana organ, as every time he moved his finger he vividly felt Catalina's mana reacting. Perhaps that was why Catalina seemed to be continually flinching. I should probably stop. Young-ho felt like he could get addicted to this feeling. The stimulus was too much for a man, such as him, who had attended an all-male high school. Young-ho quickly pulled back his hand and stepped back from Catalina. Catalina breathed a small sigh of relief. He felt like a tyrannical boss, who would subjugate his employees to his various whims. It was then. "You're welcome to touch my horn as well." Elgar spoke while sticking his head out with eagerness. Unlike Catalina's, Elgar's horns were light gray and located on his forehead, resembling more of a rhino's horn. Thinking back to Catalina's response when he was touching her horns, Young-ho swiftly stepped past him without a second thought. He instead looked down at the two goblins, who had been ignored for a while, and spoke to them. "Anyway, you two now have horns. Master? Shall I give you both a name?" Young-ho had once again ignored Elgar's question and inquired further. The spirit of the dungeon replied. "Would you like to register names for the new dungeon spirits?" Young-ho responded by nodding and then pondered for a while. If what Elgar had said was true, then eventually this dungeon would be filled with dozens of spirits. However, these were the first two, so he wanted to give them special names. I don't know. I'll just give them any name. A name had to be both easy to remember and unique. Furthermore, the goblins weren't exactly intelligent, so they needed names that were easy to memorize. "Right, you're John, and you're Ron." At Young-ho's declaration, the goblins blinked and then broke out with ecstatic smiles. "John, John. Ron, Ron." The strength type was John, while the stamina type was named Ron. The two continued to repeat their names several times and then bowed down to Young-ho. "Master. Thank you. Thank you. Happy, happy. Spirits are content. The employees' satisfaction level has increased." A smile was also drawn on Young-ho's face. This time, Catalina asked. "Excuse me, Master. Huh? Can the power of evolution be used on anyone?" Of course, it was probable to Young-ho that this question was going to be asked, so he had already prepared an answer. However, Elgar was different. He stared ferociously at Catalina, causing her to flinch with widened eyes. After recognizing the sort of question she had just asked, Catalina quickly knelt down in front of Young-ho. She bowed her head towards him. "I apologize, Master, for such an invasive question. Please forgive me." Her long ears started to tremble slightly. Young-ho felt embarrassed at her remorseful behavior, but soon understood the nature of the situation. The power of the Demon King was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. And Catalina had just asked one of her master's greatest secrets. It seemed like the previous owner was a bit of a despot. After deeply sighing, Young-ho knelt down and helped Catalina stand up. She still couldn't meet his gaze, so he softly spoke to her. "You know, you two are part of my family. Unlike the other spirits, both of you are special. So, it's okay to ask questions like that." The satisfaction level didn't increase? He had expected to be notified of an increase in the level of satisfaction, just like before, but the spirit of the dungeon didn't seem to say anything. However, Young-ho was still satisfied, As both Elgar and Catalina looked touched, he continued to talk, with a smile on his face. Of course, the power of evolution can be used on you too as well. Both of you can become stronger. Oh, so that's why you asked that question before. Elgar spoke quietly as he seemed to realize something. He seemed to remember Young-ho asking a question about whether the strength or stamina type was better. Catalina, would you like to evolve? Young-ho's sudden question caused Catalina's face to turn a bright beetroot red, though only for a short time. Quickly turning around to take a look at the goblins, Catalina hesitated and then timidly replied. I'm not sure I want to look like that. As a woman, she still wanted to maintain her appearance. Young-ho jokingly moved his hands, and even though she had tightly shut her eyes, she didn't back down. Young-ho laughed cheerfully, and then lightly flicked her forehead. I can't do it right now anyway. I'll let you know when you meet the correct conditions. And evolution doesn't just mean that you'll gain big muscles. As soon as she felt Young-ho flick her head, she opened her eyes and nodded. Her two long ears were, of course, drooping. I'll become addicted if I'm not careful. Was teasing her always this fun? Young-ho turned his attention from Catalina to Elgar. As if he was waiting for that moment, Elgar spoke. He looked like he was prepared to say something. Master, there's something I must tell you. After seeing Elgar's face, Young-ho adopted a serious expression and slightly nodded his head, indicating Elgar to speak. There are still some emergency funds available. They aren't the assets of the Mammon family, but rather the assets that I've collected in case of emergencies. As soon as he finished talking, Elgar took a small pouch out from a pocket next to his chest. Catalina gasped in surprise, with widely opened eyes. It's only a little bit of money. But, you'll be able to purchase another one-star spirit with it. If it's the lowest ranking spirits like goblins, you might be able to purchase 3. No, maybe even 4 of them. Elgar held out the pouch. Young-ho wasn't sure how to receive it, so Elgar firmly placed it into Young-ho's hands and bowed his head. Forgive me for showing you disrespect. This foolish old spirit was hiding this money in preparation for the worst outcome. However, I was convinced just now of the true power of Master. Master is the only one who can restore the House of Mammon again to its former glory. As per usual, Elgar had tears filling his eyes. Catalina's eyes were also turning a slight shade of red. Please. Master. Please spend this money. The dungeon needs more spirits. He now understood why Elgar had given him this money. Young-ho lightly bit his lips. To be honest, he found these kinds of melodramatic situations to be quite awkward. But he understood how Elgar felt. What thoughts did Catalina and Elgar have when they first met? Were they dreaming of restoring the House of Mammon? That's probably unlikely. What they probably wanted was to just give their dying dungeon some last support. However, Elgar now truly dreamed of restoring the might of the House of Mammon. Honestly, he did feel a bit pressured by Elgar. Moreover, Elgar had hidden the money to plan for the worst outcome, and even though it was his own money, the very act of hiding something would have usually been considered quite disrespectful. However, that didn't mean that Young-ho was annoyed at Elgar. Young-ho eventually put on a smile towards him. Thank you, I shall accept this money, Elgar. Young-ho sat on the throne, with the plan of once again visiting the demon market. Well, this is an unexpected visit.